Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Caught on the Mic. I'm Michael Clark. I find that it is only appropriate that I am wearing a Smashing Pumpkins shirt right before we take a deep dive into a talk about the 1990s and 1990s nostalgia. My next guest is an author. He's actually from Nebraska also, but he lives in New York currently, by the name of Ross Benesch. He's got a book coming out in April called 1999, the year that low culture conquered America and kickstarted our bizarre times. I know that is a long title, but it is incredibly truthful. I even had to look at my notes to make sure I got it right. I hope you guys enjoy this episode. As always, listener and viewer discretion is advised. Ross Benesch joins me on Caught on the Mic today. Ladies and gentlemen, Happy New Year. Welcome to a brand new episode of Caught on the Mic. You may be familiar with my next guest. He has contributed pieces to Esquire, Rolling Stone, Entertainment Weekly. He is a regular contributor to Bloomberg TV and the LA Times. And he's got a new book coming out April 22nd, 2025, that covers a year near and dear to all of our hearts, 1999, and how it parallels to the times that we are living in right now. He's a fellow Nebraskan by way of New York. Ross Benesch, how are you doing? Welcome to the show.
I'm doing good. Go Big Red, baby.
You know what? You just got to trust the process. It's going to be our year next year.
Off-season national champs for the 8th, 9th year in a row.
Well, at least we made it to a bowl game this year.
Oh, hell yeah. I was there. It was amazing.
Well, man, Happy New Year. Thanks for reaching out and offering to do the show. Your book, 1999, the year low culture conquered America and kickstarted our bizarre times. That is a long title, but incredibly accurate.
Yeah, there's a lot going on with trashy 90s entertainment that shows up in our world today. You could look at the inauguration that's coming up. Or actually, when are you releasing this episode? I shouldn't say it, but that's coming up. Maybe it'll have passed.
It's coming up. This episode's dropping next week.
Okay. Yeah, you can look at what's going to happen with the inauguration, what happened at the GOP convention. Just the way even Beanie Babies and all the collecting that we do now with NFTs, the loyalty of juggalos is everywhere. The trashiness of the late 90s is all around us. Netflix just released a big Jerry Springer documentary yesterday. We can't get away from this stuff.
No, and it is crazy because I do think about that a lot. And like I was telling you before we started recording, I sent the profile of your book on Amazon to a couple of buddies of mine, and it kind of turned into this spiraling conversation where we were talking about the 90s specifically, and Woodstock 94 versus Woodstock 99, how they occurred in the same decade, but they felt like two completely different entities and totally different festivals just because of the way the 90s shook themselves out.
Well, yeah, they're not going to make multiple, big budgeted documentaries about Woodstock 94 like they did with 99. There's not much to report on 94 there.
No. There was like a mud fight or something along those lines.
Boring entertainment. That'd be a boring piece of media.
So how did you land on this as far as being subject matter and making that parallel between 99 and 2024, 25, if you will?
Yeah, so I originally wanted to write just a book on kind of a pretentious take on low culture because I like all this shit. Like I like pro wrestling. There's some reality shows I like. I used to watch Jerry Springer with my parents when I was growing up. And then as I was writing the book, I noticed the majority of the things that I like that are trashy are from the late 90s. It's probably because that's when I was a kid, and that has a lot to do with it. So I formed it around that. And if I was gonna pick a year to make like a really big impact point, when I looked at all these things, they seem to peak more often than not right at the turn of the millennium. So that's why I picked
Hmm.
99 over. You could write probably a similar book about 96 or 97 or even 2001. But there's something about that weird Y2K energy. And, like they tried to retire all the Beanie Babies on New Year's Eve to send the prices up, and it didn't work. There's just like a lot of these weird stunts like that. There were a bunch of
Right.
porn stars that tried to have sex with the highest number of partners as possible in 99, and they all went on Jerry Springer and Howard Stern to promote it. There were so many of these little artifacts that there were more of them in 99 than in any other year. So that's why I picked that year. And, you know, I just see everything in the 90s comes back right now. Like, how many reboots do we have and sequels, and anything that was a popular IP in the 90s is still basically having new entertainment about it produced right now. So I wanted to focus on the low culture though, because I feel like that stuff gets it's usually just dismissed, but it was so popular. Like Jerry Springer was the most watched daytime show. You can laugh at it all you want and make fun of people for watching it, but it has an effect on the culture if 8 million people are watching it every day for many years. So I just kind of collected all these things. There's you could write topics, you could write essays on other topics that I excluded. For instance, Limp Bizkit does not have its own chapter, but I thought about it, and
Right.
this is what I came up with.
It is fascinating because again, whenever I shared your book with my buddies, we talked about a lot about the 90s actually, but we talked about how 1997 kind of set the table for the culmination of all things in 99. Like how the Monday Night Wars kind of really took a hold
Oh
in
yeah.
1997, and
Also,
using
96
pro
Bash at the Beach was when WCW
right.
really rose. So 97 was a year of full momentum, basically until Starrcade at the end of the year when they kind of had a little bit of a botch pay-per-view with Sting.
Right, right. But we talk about how society is essentially pro wrestling, how
Oh
pro
yeah.
wrestling used to mimic society and now it's the other way around. Like
Kayfabe is
society,
everywhere. Like
right.
the suspending disbelief to advance a storyline, even though you know it's bullshit. That's like everywhere in our culture now. Whether that's like a PR firm telling you something or a corporation, it's not just in wrestling. It's certainly in our politics.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it doesn't realistically, I tend to, as a content creator, podcaster, I tend to shy away from or give the perception of neutrality with politics. I obviously have
Yeah.
my own personal beliefs, but it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. It's on both sides.
Oh yeah,
The
so like on the left, the ACLU put out this statement, I don't know, probably a year or two ago about how abortion bans are going to harm LGBT people the most. And I'm like, who the hell's getting abortions? It's people having man and a woman having sex most of the time, you know.
right.
But they couch everything in this disadvantaged minority group speak, and that just really reads as a weird thing to think about, like gay men being the people most or lesbians being the people most affected by an abortion. But you almost have to suspend your disbelief to believe some of the shit that the ACLU tells you.
It is pro wrestling in the fact that baby faces and heels exist on both sides of the fence and on both political parties,
Oh yeah.
both spectrums. They play up to it and play up storylines, and it's like a storyline that never
I mean, if you watch
concludes, man.
CNN or Fox News, the way they bring on the guests, even like the lighting and the way they talk to them, like the way a liberal is treated on Fox News or the way a conservative is treated on CNN, it's really like a wrestling storyline that's being built up. Like Jake Tapper's just gonna come on and just talk down, and they're gonna even show this guy kind of sweating and being in weird light. And they do the same in Fox News. They bring some like clueless liberal on. He's basically there to be a squash match,
Right.
like when Goldberg would destroy someone in 10 seconds, that's what they're doing.
Right, right. Absolutely. So going back to the book, how do you break this down? How do you break down the compare and contrast between that time and now?
Yeah, that was probably the toughest part because I leaned very heavily on just like the 90s history fascinates me. That like the journalism and the research aspect, I could have just done like a things that happened in 1999 and been really happy with it. But I tried to have at least the intro and the conclusions and then a little references sprinkled throughout that would link. Okay, this is how this is resurfacing again today. So, for instance, I have a chapter on video game violence being like the moral panic of the 90s. So, after the
Right.
Columbine shooting, everyone was trying to blame the video game Doom for causing these kids to, shoot up their school. And while we don't blame video games probably to the degree that we do today, there's other things we blame for youth, like antisocial behavior. Like we're trying to ban TikTok as a country right now. I think in 25 years, they'll look back and they'll be like, did they really try to ban TikTok? Like it'll seem very innocuous in 25 years,
Right.
the TikTok. So each of these essays has something like that. With reality TV and talk shows, that's just so much of our culture now. That was pretty clear. But I've linked Beanie Babies to NFTs because it seems like there's always a fad that we lose our minds over. And the Beanie Babies seem stupid because they're just plushies with pellets in them. How could you use them as an investment vehicle? When you explain the
Right.
concept of an NFT to someone now that market's cooled down, it's like, well, why would you buy that? That you don't even own the image. What are you doing?
So, do you think when you look back to the 90s and how the internet stronghold really occurred in 99, because Napster's biggest year was 98,
Yeah,
99,
99 is when they
and
launched
2000.
publicly,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they didn't
So,
have long because they got shut down legally.
right. Right. But if you look at all of that in the past 25 years, do you think the internet taking a stronghold that year really made it feel to society like the 90s never really ended?
You know, you could say the internet kind of crossed the threshold in 99 because according to the Census Bureau, when they did the 2000 census, that was right when 50% of the US population would regularly go online. And by regularly, I think it was only like once a month at that time. But it's right at that moment that most people like knew how to go on the internet. They weren't doing it every day. They weren't doing it the way we were doing it. Most people, the other 50% didn't do it whatsoever at all. But they're kind of crossing the Rubicon of going into this digital world, and those anxieties were prevalent in all these things I talk about. Especially with internet porn. They tried to regulate the internet in the late 90s, Congress did, and every bill was like attempting they would always they'd always put it under the guise of like we're attempting to stop minors from accessing porn, but then the law would have so many other repercussions and it would eventually get struck down in courts because you'd be suppressing so many other things that are lawful. And like if you look at James Exxon, Nebraska senator, former Nebraska governor, he's the one who sponsored the Communications Decency Act. He would get up at Congress and he'd pull out a binder of pictures of porn that he printed out and put together because he didn't know how to use the internet. He had like a staffer put together a binder of like dirty images and he just say, look how terrible this is. He was very anxious about the information highway.
And I'm sure it was a staffer that put that together for him.
Oh yeah, that would have took him years. He's got other things to do at this time, I would think.
Oh my goodness. Well, 99 was also the year of the first viral marketing campaign. You think about the Blair Witch Project came out
Oh yeah.
summer 1999, and that was the first time the internet was used when they were trying to another, callback, kayfabe, whether or not the Blair Witch Project was real or not.
Oh, they did an amazing job with that too. They had like the actors go away and not be around publicly. So you think
Right.
like these people really died. They were really murdered in the woods. Their website had like all of these little Easter eggs and clues to help you try to feel like you're putting together the pieces of a puzzle that was fictional, but you felt like was real. But yeah, the Blair Witch Project, it was really it was a more technological version of what happened in the 1970s horror film Snuff. For those
Right.
who aren't familiar, Snuff was a horror film that purported to show a real life murder. That's where like the phrase snuff films comes from.
Right.
and it was all marketing BS. It wasn't actually a person really killed, but they got people to believe so. The distributors of the movie got people to get really up in arms and picket them and protest them. And every time would have protests, they would sell more tickets. This was back in the days of like Times Square, gritty movie theaters, sort of things. Snuff is very much a rated R movie, but Blair Witch kind of did what Snuff did. They had a viral marketing campaign where they lied about the truthfulness of what was on. They tried to portray death authentically, even though it was a staged and fictional thing, and they got people to buy into it, and that people wanted to believe it. I think even if people didn't totally believe it, go, that's kind of bullshit. It's fun to believe. It's like pro wrestling. Like I really,
Right.
I really want to believe Stone Cold Steve Austin is out there hitting his boss in the head with a bedpan. Like I want to believe that's what they're really doing, and this isn't something they wrote to get me all amped up about.
Maybe a counterpoint or a counter to this low culture idea that you're presenting in your book. Do you wonder if maybe those were the last years of innocence before social media kind of sunk its teeth into society?
Reading all this 90s stuff at the time, people then didn't seem to think it was so innocent.
Right.
Like the call to regulate porn. There were like people freaking out about their kids spending too much money on Pokemon cards, and Time and Newsweek had these stories about like how Pokemon's a Ponzi scheme that's gonna like ruin your kids. So at the time, they probably felt that like, oh man, the 70s were the last time that like you were innocent, and now like this new thing called the internet is ruining us. I do think my own childhood, now that I'm raising kids and I'm seeing how what they're going through is different than what I went through. I think it is great that I had a lot of time that wasn't with a screen, where I'd just be outside riding my bike or cutting down trees that we don't even own with my friends. I don't know how much kids do that now, but this idea that like the innocence is lost. I feel like everyone is anxious about their current times.
Think back to all of it. And I do reflect back to things like Columbine occurring that year, the pro wrestling boom of that era, and to like Woodstock 99. Let's spend a few minutes talking about that.
Yeah.
Because there are a few good documentaries about that. How do you feel music and pop culture influenced society then versus how it influences society now?
Well, back then, big labels had a much bigger say in what people would listen to. So,
Mm-hmm.
I personally like Limp Bizkit. I know a lot of people want to shit on
I
him.
do too.
Like, I like Fred Durst, just so obnoxious. Yeah, like I just love hearing him say shit like, "Break your fucking face tonight."
Yeah.
But they're very much a band that's it's mocked, and they know that they came out of their Ozfest sets on top of your 13-foot replica toilet, so
Yep.
they know what they're doing. But Limp Bizkit was like a band that was very much shoved down people's throats. Like it felt like Viacom was just pushing them. Like Fred Durst dated MTV Talent Scout. They would thank TRL people like in their album liner notes. It was like they're a proud sellouts. I don't know how else to describe it. So you got them all the time. And they put out a new album, whether people want it or not. Like TRL is going to play Nookie again. They're just going to keep playing Nookie. You don't have that quite as much now. People, there's still huge artists like Taylor Swift or Beyonce or whatever, but there's no apparatus that can shove them in your face quite as much. So I think an individual artist back then, if they were on a big label and they made inroads with MTV, they could influence the culture greater than any artist now, because everyone has a Bandcamp, everything's on Spotify, and there's nothing that it's the same thing with our TV shows. Like the most popular TV shows and most popular music right now just don't have the same market penetration that the most
Right.
popular stuff in the 90s did. Like we don't even hardly have water cooler pop culture to talk about, because like the band you're really into might be something I've never even heard of, because that's what got served on your Spotify algorithm.
But kind of going back to like Limp Bizkit and the NSYNCs and
Oh
Christina
yeah, I'm
and
talking about Limp
Britney.
Bizkit being pushed. No one was more pushed than the boy bands and Christina Aguilera.
But the thing is if you listen in recent years, there seems to be a cultural forgiveness for Limp Bizkit, for NSYNC, for Christina Aguilera, for Britney Spears, to where the people either loved them or they absolutely hated them in 1999. What do you suppose changed in society that allowed that sense of forgiveness to permeate?
That's a good question. And you know, I even see it with ICP. Like
Yes.
Blender Magazine, USA Today, like ICP is the worst band in the world. That was like 2000 to 2010. That's how they were always portrayed. And now they're portrayed as like Robin Hood is marching to Washington D.C. to defend against this bullshit gang designation, and it's by the same like publications often that ripped on them. So you know, a lot of these '90s bands, that were mocked, have really come full circle. Uh, I, I just there's just so much '90s nostalgia right now and a longing for that time that any band that had a huge following still has millions of fans out there that misses the days when they grew up listening to that band.
Right.
And I
Right.
think that's a big part of it. Why there's like a little bit of revisionism about NSYNC being awesome when people shit on them back then, or Limp Bizkit or whatever.
Bringing that kind of full circle, and your introduction to me was through Rob Harvilla. And when I had Rob on my show, I talked about um how I never felt like a sense of nostalgia for the 90s was ever going to set in. And then one day it just clicked. And all of
Yeah.
a sudden I'm nostalgic for the 90s. I never thought it was going to happen. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying about the internet kind of making it seem like the 90s never end. When you were doing research for this book, did you find that was kind of a common feeling amongst people?
Um, I don't know if I got a good answer to that about how most people feel about like they weren't going to have '90s nostalgia and now they do. What I did find is that there tends to be a nostalgia for the decade that's about 30 years prior to the one you're living in. Like in the '80s, you did like, Back to the Future and, those types of TV shows that were set in the
Yes.
'50s, like Happy Days, like, well, no, Happy Days wasn't out. That was out earlier. But in the '80s, you had a lot of 1950s revisionism. And I think
Yes.
like 10 years ago, you had a lot of like nostalgia for the '80s and shows that would take place in the '80s and where we're going to bring back everything from the '80s. Right now, we're on that wave, but for the '90s. And there's Chuck Klosterman's book, The '90s, kind of made an interesting case that it's like the last decade. Like no one thinks of like 2000 to 2010 as like a coherent decade with its own look and feel and type of music, or 2010 to 2020. So it'll be interesting to see if that keeps up, because the '50s through the '90s, each one has their own feel, and the bands and the shows that were popular then. Um, Kind of due to the internet and changing media distribution so much. Um, Beyond the really early 2000s, when you have like Frosted Tips and Jinko jeans and all that shit, once
Right.
you get to like 2010, I don't know if that will be viewed as a concrete decade. But maybe I'm a little bit younger than you. Maybe I'm viewing that right now and I'm thinking we're never gonna have 2010 nostalgia. And 15 years later, like every damn show from 2010 is gonna be the homepage of my Netflix.
Oh my goodness. I saw a meme the other day and it was talking about Dazed and Confused. And it says, if Dazed and Confused was made today, it would be based on the year 2004. And I was like, fuck you. I'm over it. You know what I mean? But
Yeah.
you don't think about things whenever you're living in those moments. But, it all eventually comes back around. With that said, it does seem like every decade or every generation and every pop culture zeitgeist kind of has some sort of conclusion to it. So, with 1999 being the closing of the 90s, um, there seemed to be a natural transition in society to what we considered normalcy. Do you see that happening with what's going on in society right now?
The end of '99 could also be there's a few ways to view the end of the '90s. Of course, like the new year happened. That's that's the concrete, like, actual end. The clocks turn.
Right.
It's the year 2000. There's been a half dozen writers who have said, like, the 90s really started in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, and they ended in '01 when the Twin Towers fell. In my book, I make the case that Joey Buttafuoco's scandal was the 90s because in 1992 they had the sex scandal where the overage mechanic, the old mechanic is sleeping with the young woman and she shoots his wife in the face. And by 1999, American Beauty, based on that incident, wins every Academy Award that
Right.
there is. That's like, it started out as the trashiest thing, like a Long Island mechanic sleeping with the high school chick, and it ends like with and accolades on the biggest stage of pop culture. So there's a lot of ways that you could like frame um, the 90s, what began and what ended. I don't know though what's gonna be the thing for 2010. And I know what I was going. I'm kind of rambling. I forgot where the hell I was going to go with that. What I was gonna say is the 90s actually didn't end peacefully or with normalcy though, because you could also make the case that the 90s, the like so-called like peace and prosperity of the 90s and in the good years with Clinton, those ended with the 2000 election when the Supreme Court basically decided who would be president, and that kickstarted the really intense hyper-partisanship, the
Right.
and the huge distrust in institutions. So like if you look at like the 2000 election and how things went down in Florida, you could say, well, wow, actually the 90s ended with more despair than anything.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it's a nonpartisan point too. I mean,
And then those campaigns started in the late 90s, so the election might have been 2000, but like those were 90s Gore and Bush. Those were 90s politicians.
right. Right. So
You
kind
asked
of
some good
put
questions. I don't have the best answer, so I'm just trying to make up shit to keep along.
I absolutely love that. No, man, this stuff is catnip to me. I love talking pop culture. I love talking about general generationism at large, because it's particularly interesting right now in society. I don't ever talk about what I do for a living for my day job on my show, but I will say I lead people, and the workforce right now has the most generations working at one point in time. I think there's like 4 or 5 generations in the workforce right now, and every generation has a different sense of currency and a
God,
different
no one can retire anymore. That's what I think when I hear
right.
that.
Well, yeah, that's part of the problem. but the thing is everybody has a different social currency, and they all look at the time where they came of age with their rose tinted lenses. Is that something that we're all kind of guilty of in regards to the 90s?
People from probably late 20s to like late 40s or early 50s, probably, yeah. We're
Yeah.
all kind of that was like our sweet time, and it's the same way like my dad talks about the 60s. He kind of ignores
Hmm.
all the bad stuff and just talks about like the cool things you got to do and like the Beatles and all these bands and shows he liked. But um I'll probably sound like an old fogey when my kids are growing up when I'm talking about the 90s,
Right.
and they'll be like, "We read the history books. That time sucked." Like you you couldn't even get health insurance if you had a disease, you know?
What blows my mind is my 17-year-old daughter is singing in bands for the first time. And, that was kind of my thing. And I would think, okay, she's going to be into like the Taylor Swifts, the Sabrina Carpenters, the Chapel Roans. And, she's got respect for all of those people. But what she's really digging her teeth into is covering Smashing Pumpkins, Veruca Salt, all the music from the 90s. And I'm just like, what led to that sense of influence? I mean, aside from me, because she's discovered most of these
Yeah.
acts on her own, like it really makes you evaluate how valuable of a generation that was.
Well, and what's defined as classic rock changes. I was in, Lincoln, a few weeks ago. I think I was listening to was probably listening to 92.9 The Eagle would probably be my guess. And this is the station that I grew up with, listening like CCR with my dad, or the
Right.
Eagles would be on there, and it was like Green Day and Oasis. I was like, what the hell,
Oh, I know.
That's classic rock now.
Oh,
And when something is in the canon, it's like you just hear it at the grocery store. You hear it in commercials now. So whether or not she may have sought out those 90 bands, they're so pervasive that
right.
she's probably constantly exposed in ways that we don't fully appreciate. And
Right.
then those bands that were popular, like, they're the ones that are being ripped off and covered now by new bands.
Right. Oh, I have the biggest asshole of a friend on New Year's Day. He posted a bunch of graphics on Facebook. He says, "These albums are turning 30 this year." And there was No Doubt's Tragic Kingdom, the first Foo Fighters record, Oasis, What's the Story, Morning Glory. And I'm like, oh, you son of a bitch. You know?
Yeah, soon the music that had in college will be classic rock. Like, that's probably only 5 years away if it hasn't happened already.
Just kind of putting this book and this topic to the side for just a moment. As a writer and as somebody that creates work and has to, kind of think outside of the box as a journalist, what inspires you topically to write these things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like a psychologist could ask me this too, because they'd be like, why do you go down these rabbit holes when there's no fucking money in doing so? Uh, all the books that I've done have been on very different topics, and what I've concluded is that I do these passion projects where I go down deep research rabbit holes on things that I already have a predilection for, and they are things that were that I either was a part of or desired when I was young, and that's Nebraska, trashy entertainment, and sex. So that's what all my books that they've been on. 2 sex books, the Nebraska book and this. So those are the things that I like. Those are the things that I talk about anyways. So if I'm not doing my day job as a market research analyst, or having to do like other work that I take on for money, if I'm just with my friends, the 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 books that I've had are the things that I would normally just find interest in. Like, I found interest in Nebraska because I'm from there, and I lived most of my life there. I mean, I'm kind of a freak, I guess. Who doesn't like sex? But I wrote 2 books on it, and then all this stuff now is just me trying to give like an intellectual explanation for why the stuff that I liked as a kid that was shit on so much, it actually has a big impact on society. So if I'm going to put this much time into it for like little financial payoff, I go for the things that are really near and dear to me. I wouldn't write a book on like cryptocurrency unless if someone paid me a ton of money, because it's not something I'm like passionate about. But you come to me and say you want to write about Jerry Springer, or you want to write about the history of the place you grew up in. But it is kind of idiosyncratic, and I probably would have a better career if I would have chose one lane and done 4 books on a topic and build an expertise and a following on it. But each thing has been its own. It's like new. I don't have to, like, after the Nebraska one, I didn't want to really do that anymore.
Right.
This one this is by far the most fun I've had, but I'm also like looking forward to not reading about the 90s every day. I've been doing that for like 3 years. Like, I'm not once I'm done with this press tour, like, I'm not going to read any book from the 90s or about the 90s for probably 5 years.
Well, I think that's you know, first and foremost, I'm gonna pay forward some advice you didn't ask for, but um spending the past 5 years doing this podcast, I have found the most successful people find success in the things that they're passionate about. It doesn't come overnight. It is a marathon. It's not a sprint, but the most successful people find success in the things that they are passionate about. With that said, what are some things that you've learned about yourself by taking a deep dive into these passions for the sake of this creative output?
That's I've learned that I could start with a really messy idea, and then eventually turn it into something half coherent. It takes a lot of time. But if you looked at my research notes for any of these books and like where the proposal started from where it ends, it's just like a kaleidoscope to start. And it's just like you just throw in like paint at the wall. It looks kind of crazy. It's just little facts about all sorts of things that seem unrelated. And then eventually I can do a lot of my best organization and thinking when I'm not actually planning to do that. Like a lot of the work on this may not come when I'm on my computer saying, "Oh, I got to write this chapter because the editor needs it right now." A lot of it's like I'm just waiting, like to see a doctor, or I'm on the train for longer than I should be, and I'm just kind of thinking about like a documentary I saw, or I'm reading a book, and then I think of something and I write it in my phone. I have like I have like a bunch of the notes app. I just have
Right.
like a ton of documents where I just jot stupid shit. Half of it never sees the light of day. So I get creative inspiration when I'm not looking for it. Is what I learned, and then I think I've done a better job of preserving my better thoughts, or my more like interesting research findings, rather than I used to like read stuff and then I wouldn't write it down, or I wouldn't take a note, and then I'd forget about it, or I'd think of the fact, where the hell did that come from? But now it's like I'll take a screenshot, or I'll write down like page 150 of this book like says this. I'm gonna cite this. Like I don't know what I'm gonna say, and that's like so interesting. I'm gonna cite it. So I've kind of gotten into a rhythm a little bit doing this stuff, and I also learned that like the marketing stuff when I did the first book, and something that's really changed for me in these passions. When I did the first book, I felt I should have done more marketing. I felt like it was like the worst thing ever. Like I gotta pitch people. Oh my god, this sucks. I wrote the
Right.
book. Can't they just come talk to me? Can't like everyone just come? Um, and there are, interviews that are uncomfortable that you don't want to do, but you're doing them because you want to get the book out. But a lot of the most enjoyable moments of doing these books have been stuff like this, like being on your podcast, or I gotta like have some interesting conversations with people for the last book. Some of them I've met and hung out with in real life afterwards,
Right.
and I wouldn't have even thought about getting in touch with that person, but I'm only getting in touch with them because I'm being shameless and I got this book. But then it turns out they have that same interest, and I've made a lot of connections on that. And the books don't necessarily make the money or change my life the way I dreamed they would have when I moved to New York to do this, but I've gotten those other little pieces of fulfillment along the way that I try to um, appreciate, because you got to appreciate what you get.
Yes. Yes, that is so true because I can compare that to this podcasting journey very similarly, spending a decade plus doing music, releasing albums, and then having this layover where I didn't do anything for a long period of time. And then, of course, this became a pandemic project. But as a result of this podcast, I have made so many friends and created such a community and been able to accomplish things that I never would have thought of accomplishing otherwise had I not taken the jump and done this. So, we're talking about this press tour for this new book that's about to drop. Do you have notes or do you have a plan for what's to come next after this one drops?
Huh, well, I got another child being born a few weeks before the book, so my plan is just to keep them alive and keep myself alive. So creatively, after this might be it for a little while, because I'll have two kids um, under 2.5 years old
Woo!
living in New York, and two dogs. So in an apartment. So right now I can't even think about doing anything like fun like that. I have books I would like to write. There's even some children's books I've talked about with my wife that are dog related that I would like to
Sure.
pursue. Um, People tell me that I should start doing JD Vance impersonations. That I have the look and demeanor. So maybe I'll dabble into. So I'll have to do something to keep myself sane at some point, but it's gonna be a little bit of a layover, just dadding real hard, and then after I come up from that, when the kids are like out, not daycare age, and not shitting their own pants all the time, I'll think about what I really want to do. If someone wants to reach out to
Uh,
me and do the project, that's great, but I don't have the energy to hustle for a little while.
sometimes the project will find you anyways.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward to doing all that stuff, but it'll be it won't be this.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you are so inclined, my guest is fantastically interesting. Type his name, Ross Benish, into YouTube, and you can see interviews on the Young Turks and different podcast appearances and such, covering a myriad of different topics. I'm so glad you reached out to me, man.
Hey, I'm glad that you had me on the show and we got a text about Dylan Raiola and everything about the transfer portal, because I don't get that a lot here. I get that when I go home, but you know what I mean?
Right. Well, my closing question, and it's my most favorite question to ask absolutely everybody, is what's your advice for making the world a better place tomorrow than what it is today?
Yeah, you got to do something small because you can't fill the ocean with one drop of water. I think when you're really uh, pissed off, because there's a lot of things that can piss you off in this world. I just had a health insurance thing today that really pissed me off. You just gotta walk away from it for a little bit, and then you'll feel, it's not going to solve the problem, but the desire to want to smash the universe will go away somewhat, a day later. And if we all did that, I think a lot of these like little minor things that blow up wouldn't happen as often.
Awesome. Tell my audience where they can find you online and where they can find your book.
Well, you can find the book on any website that sells books. I prefer Bookshop over Amazon because we do not need more tech titans controlling our world. And you can find me on rossbenish.com, ROSSBENES. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook occasionally, but the best way to reach me is just to shoot me an email at myname@gmail.com.
Thank you so much for doing this show. I am so glad we're connected and glad to now call you a friend. The world is a much better place with you in it, my friend.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike.